This video explains how to polish a sample. You're going to start by placing the samples along with the balancing epoxy inside the tray so that they're all flush against the counter. When you're doing this, make sure to use either 3, 4, or 6 pucks. That way the configuration is symmetric and the samples will be properly balanced in the polisher. And then you're going to tighten all of the screws so that the samples and the epoxy are firmly in place. And then you're going to put the sample tray in place by lifting the metal covering, putting in the sample tray, and then pulling the metal covering right back down. And then to see the steps for the polishing process, you're going to look in the Bueller polishing manual shown above. You're going to flip through the book until you see the metal that you're working with, which in this case is aluminum alloys, and you're going to look at the steps that it lays out for you. So now we're going to begin our first round of polishing by following the steps laid out in that first row. For the time, it just says until plain, so we're going to start with 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and then we can add as needed. For the force, it says around 20 newtons, so we're keeping that the same. We're switching the directions so that they're going in the same direction. And then the water is going to stay on, and now all the settings there are correct. Now we are selecting the grit paper specified by the book and placing it on the magnetic disc that will then be placed on the polisher. Now we're adjusting the rest of the settings as specified by the book. For this round, the sample is going to be water cooled, so we're just making sure that the water is running properly, and then we're going to set it to run active so it runs the entire process, and we're also going to adjust that RPM back to 300. And now we're ready to begin polishing by turning the top of the machine and then pressing the 2 buttons on the sides simultaneously until the timer begins. We also need to adjust the water supply so that it's pointing directly at the samples. Now we're going to periodically check the samples and keep the machine running until the samples are plain and uniform looking. This is an example of what the samples look like when they need to go for a little bit longer. And then this is what the samples will look like when you're ready for the next step. They should all reflect the light evenly. Now, to prepare for the next step, we're going to rinse and dry the samples. We use a regular paper towel to dry off the tray and epoxy pucks. When drying off the sample, we use these special Kimtech wipes, and you're going to lightly pat the tops of each sample. Be careful not to wipe because you don't want to risk scratching the freshly polished sample. Now we're ready for the second step, which is going to be in that second row. We're going to start by adjusting that time to 5 minutes as the book described. The force application and force units are going to stay the same as before. And then we're going to change the rotation directions. And then we're not going to be using any water for this step either. And then we're going to adjust that water to off and put the RPM on 150. So now all the settings should be ready to go. And we're going to remove the old surface and put it on a drying rack. And then we're going to replace it with the Ultra Pad one as specified by the book. And then for the abrasive, we're using this 9-micron suspension. And then to prevent any overpouring or spilling, we're going to go ahead and pour out a cup. And then before we begin, we're going to go ahead and pour some onto the surface. And now we're ready to begin, and we're going to go ahead and start the machine by pressing the 2 buttons on the sides. And then periodically, during the 5 minutes of this round of polishing, we're going to pour some more of that abrasive. This is what the surface is going to look like when it's about time to pour some more abrasive. And then after 5 minutes is up, you're done with this round of polishing, and you're going to go ahead and wash off the sample and dry it off in the same way as before, and then you're ready to move on to the next step. Also, be sure to rinse off the surface and put it back on the drying rack. Now we're ready for the third step, which is going to be in that third row. You're going to start by adjusting that time down to 4 minutes. And then the force application and force units are going to stay the same. You're going to adjust that direction so it's the same way. And then the water is going to be off again for this round. So the same as before, the water is going to stay off and the RPM is going to be at 150. And then for the surface for this round, you're going to select Trident as specified by the book. And then for the abrasive for this round, you're going to be using this 3-micron suspension. And again, you're going to pour it into a cup to prevent spilling or overpouring. Similarly to before, you're going to go ahead and start by pouring some onto the surface, and then you're ready to start this round of polishing. Again, periodically you're going to go ahead and pour some more abrasive onto the surface, and this is what the surface is going to look like when it's time to add some more abrasive. You may also need more than just 1 cup for this round of polishing, in which case you can pour some more. And then after the 4 minutes for this round of polishing is up, you're going to go ahead and rinse off the sample and dry it in the same manner as before. You're again going to rinse off the surface and put it on the drying rack so that you'll now be ready for the last round of polishing. For this last round of polishing, you're going to follow the steps in that 4th row. We're going to start by selecting the surface labeled Chemo Met and putting it on the polisher. Now we're going to adjust that time down to 1 minute and 30 seconds as specified by the book. And then we're going to again leave the force application and force units the same, and we're going to change the direction to be in opposite directions, and we're going to leave the rest of the settings alone. And the same as before, we're going to leave the water off and the RPM at 150. And then for our abrasive, we're going to go ahead and select this suspension, and we're going to pour it into a cup in the same manner as before. And then in the same way as before, you're going to go ahead and pour some onto the surface, and then you're ready to begin this last round of polishing. You're again going to periodically pour more abrasive onto the surface during this round of polishing. And then during the last 10 seconds of this final round, you're going to turn the water onto the samples. Then after this round is finished, you're again going to rinse off the samples and dry them in the same manner as before. And now you're done with this final round of polishing. So you're going to go ahead and clean off the surface and put it away. And make sure to dry off the polisher after you're done. And then when removing the finished samples from the tray, you're going to unscrew them and carefully slide them out. And then this is an example of what a polished sample should look like, but please note this one has already undergone some testing.